Right. Well, welcome to this the second lecture of the term, which is about Scotland. We've heard, or Scotland and the United Kingdom, as it says actually on the original course programme. We've heard in earlier weeks about the Constitution, the UK Constitution, about elements of devolution, particularly within the context of local government and national or regional government. And this week we're going to pick up the theme, which has come up once or twice before, but not in detail, of devolution, particularly Scotland and devolution. Clearly what we're going to hear about today is only about Scotland, but many of the issues that are raised will also apply to some extent in Wales and to a significantly different extent in Northern Ireland. But today is definitely about Scotland. And our speaker today is Professor Jim Gallagher, who has had an extraordinary range of roles, one of those few people who in Britain who really does have a career that spanned universities and the public sector and the private sector, an unusual career, but significantly in government, both as a civil servant working for ministers in the UK central government, most particularly worked within the UK government department in preparing for devolution, and then within Scottish government, and then again in the United Kingdom government. I'm sure he'll say more about this. So has enormous experience both as an official in developing and implementing policy, and indeed operating policies for Scotland within the UK and within Scotland, but secondly, of course, as a lecturer, as a practitioner within the university as well. So I'll hand over to him. I think most recently actually been involved with the Calman Commission, which I spoke about, and indeed has given evidence to the London Finance Commission, which I chaired. It's all rather it's a bit incestuous, yes, within the UK. Anyway, Jim will speak for about 55 minutes or so, and then the usual arrangements, we will take questions and answers up till about 6:30. Jim.
Okay, thanks very much, Tony. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's nice to be in the LSE, and I'm glad you've all turned out. I always enjoyed Ancient Radio 4 programme, which concluded, if you have been, thank you for listening. So I hope that we'll be able to say that at the end of this discussion. I do want to talk about Scotland and the UK, and I want to begin by asking you if you do what I do every so often, which is pinch myself and say, it is actually possible that in almost exactly 9 months' time, a decision will be taken which causes the UK, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, to cease to be as a nation state. And what I want to address myself to today is the trajectory. How did this come about? How did we get into this place? And to do that, I want to talk about the idea of the UK as a territorial state. What does it mean? We tend to think of the UK as just like a blob, kind of unitary organisation, but it has a territorial dimension, so I want to explore that a little. And I might manage to mention Wales and Northern Ireland as a special treat, though I shan't talk about London. And then I want to talk about it within that, the particular trajectory of Scotland and the Union, and then explore this interesting question of identity. It's what's driving what's going on, a question of who people think they are rather than what they want. And then we might speak briefly about the topic which Tony mentioned in particular, devolution and devolution to Scotland. And finally, we'll talk about this referendum, which happens in 9 months' time, and what it might lead to. So that's about 3 days worth of lecturing. So let's see if we can squeeze it into less than an hour. It's customary to think of the UK, when you read your A-level British Constitution textbooks, as I guess some of you might have done, to think of the UK as a unitary state, traditionally an unusually centralised state. But in fact, although the UK is, to use the monarchical word, one realm, and it has for a long time had only one parliament, it is in fact a series of unions. Unions between different pre-existing states, or at least nations. The union with Wales is probably the oldest, and it was a straightforward conquest, straightforward Norman conquest. The union with Ireland has been a terrible story of conquest and rebellion and reconquest and re-rebellion, and now secession and partition. And I'm not going to talk about Ireland today, except perhaps if you're really interested in questions. But the archetype of the argument of a union was the union between Scotland and England. Now, the union for Wales was long vestigial. There wasn't much to be said about Welsh government, except perhaps that there might or might not be a separate Welsh state church. The union with Ireland has long been seen as a major UK problem, addressed for many generations by a mixture of war and kindness, and latterly, as I say, by secession and partition, and still war and kindness, sadly. Peaceful at the moment, thank goodness. But the union with Scotland, for many years, was seen as unquestioned and established and simply part of the furniture. So arguably, today we have, rather to our surprise perhaps, 4 legislatures in this union, Westminster and 3 devolved bodies. We've always had 3 legal systems, and it's interesting that we managed to have legal systems without legislatures for a very long time. But arguably after devolution, we've got 4 polities, 4 different political systems. We have a UK one, which spans everyone, and 3 sub-national systems, which arguably have become rather more inward-looking. So let's just focus, if we may, on the Scottish one and the implications of that Scottish polity's inward-lookingness or its separateness. We have to start a very long way back, actually. We have to start not at the Parliamentary Union of 1707, but at the history before then. Because what you'll see is that unionism was always a Scottish project. The English project was conquest. That's what they wanted to do. The Scots had a problem. They had this large, powerful, aggressive, bad-tempered neighbour. How are you going to deal with it? You could fight it, or if you couldn't beat it, possibly you could join it. And the first opportunity for that, of course, came through dynastic accident, when the Scottish king succeeded to the English throne in 1603. And after 100 years of humming and hawing, a long series of religious wars, we had a parliamentary union in 1707. Both sides had fought themselves to a standstill over what was the right variety of Protestant religion. The fascinating thing about the Union of 1707 is that they agreed they were both right and that they would each retain their own state church. And in a day when the state was a vestigial entity and the church was a powerful one, that was a remarkable symbol of non-incorporation. Okay? Episcopalian religion wasn't imposed in the Scots. Equally, Presbyterianism wasn't imposed in the English. And at the time when the only other domestic power of the state was exercised through the courts and the legal system, the Scots retained their own courts and legal system. Initially, at least, just as foreign to English common law as it was to, as English common law was to Dutch or French law. So what we see is that in this negotiated deal was preserved a great deal of continuity. And this has caused the UK, rightly in my view, to be described as a union state. And that term has acquired something of a technical meaning in the literature, and it means a state which has been formed from the fusion of others, but where significant elements of the pre-union characteristics and institutions remain. Now, as far as Scotland was concerned, this union took a while to be accepted. The 18th century was pretty rough going, certainly in the first half, because, of course, of dynastic wars, the Jacobite Wars, which canvassed support in Scotland, and amusingly enough, in a completely cynical way, the House of Stuart played upon Scottish nationalism. And to this day, of course, they didn't want the Scottish crown, they wanted the English crown, they wanted the British crown. They were prepared to use the Scots in that. But to this day, Scottish nationalists sing sentimental songs about Bonnie Prince Charlie. It's something of a historical anachronism, to say no further. However, the 18th century was rough going until the second half, and when you have this extraordinary flowering, particularly in Edinburgh, but also in Glasgow, of the Scottish Enlightenment, and the beginning of a project of economic growth for Scotland within the Union, that in the 19th century, it was driven by both industrial revolution and empire, which in the 20th century continued through common identity and wars, and interestingly, still relevantly in my view, common identity in the building of a welfare state. The interesting question for us today is, what does it mean in the 21st century? We're no longer banding together against the French, I think. We're no longer seriously concerned about the imposition of somebody else's state religion on us. We may still be worried about welfare and security, both internal and external. We may still be worried about trade, which was the phrase used in 1707 for the economic interests of Scotland. But is that enough to call us, to make us hang together? And some scholars have described the Union in Scotland as having become banal, taken for granted, part of the furniture, losing its emotional heft, losing the feeling of belonging, perhaps. The idea of Britishness, several scholars like the historian Linda Colley, and to a lesser extent someone like Tom Devine, are saying the concept of Britishness, having lost all those external threats and that internal driving that brought it together, has lost meaning. Why then should the Union hold together? What does a Union state mean if nobody has any emotional investment in it? And of course, you then find, by coincidence or otherwise, that you're facing a challenge from Scottish nationalism. A language is fascinating. I had a dinner, a bizarre dinner, with a Quebec minister a couple of months back here in London, who was proud to be called a separatist, for he wanted to have a separate state. For reasons I still don't wholly understand, Scottish nationalists resent the term separate. They think that they are for the creation of a nation state, but not for the separation from an existing one. To understand quite what is going on here, I think we have to start and have a look at where Scotland is today. What sort of a place is it? Is it different from England? Is it the same? What are its characteristics that might be creating this potential division? Well, extraordinarily enough, Scotland is about the most economically typical region of the UK today, on virtually any measure. In relation to GVA per head, it's something like between 98 and 99% of the UK average. It is, in fact, roughly speaking, the third richest region of the UK, whether by GVA or by household income, after London and the South East. That's how it manages to get so close to the average, as you might expect. In labour market terms, unemployment is slightly lower, employment rates are slightly higher. And all of this, of course, ignores, in statistical terms at least, the economic activity in the North Sea off the Scottish coast, which is classified in a wonderful piece of Treasury, bad Latin, extra regio. Those of you who are Latin scholars know that it should be regionem actually, but there we are. The Treasury, for some reason, don't seem to like their Latin to be corrected. So we've got a place which is looking economically pretty sound. It may be that Scotland, one looks at the data, is marginally socially more conservative. There's not much in that. It is often thought, indeed it is repeatedly said, that Scotland is politically further to the left. And certainly Scotland returns a phalanx of Labour MPs and one solitary Tory, God bless him, who now has to be a minister for Scotland in the coalition government. The Conservatives poll very badly in the devolved election. So Scotland obviously must be a left-wing sort of a place. So one has a look at public opinion. And here is this is taken from the British Social Attitudes and the Scottish Social Attitudes surveys, and it asks what proportion of the population thinks that we should increase the taxes and spend a bit more. This tells you two things over the last decade. One, collectively, we're all getting a bit meaner. And two, for the purposes of our discussion, not much difference between the Scots and the English on this measure. So something else is going on. This is not actually about left-right politics. It's not about economic disadvantage. There are no other significant social attitudes differences. What is striking, however, about the Scots and the English, or the difference between them, is just how Scottish the Scots feel. You may think that's not a perfectly trivial point, but the question of identity really does matter. It's used politically, particularly by the Scottish National Party, who typically contrast not Scotland and England actually, but Scotland and London. And it's used also because we find, and I'll show you the data in a moment, that a feeling of identity and a view on constitutional preference seem to be quite closely linked. So, if you say to people, are you Scottish or British? Well, kind of both, you know. Well, no. If you had to choose one, which would you choose? And we see an immensely substantial difference. People in Scotland, 70+% of them think if they're forced to choose, they'd be Scottish rather than British. And a rather sad 20% of folk, no doubt, hiding behind their Daily Telegraph, think that they would regard themselves as British. And this matters politically for this reason. Let's look at the more sophisticated data now. So this is a slightly fussy chart. What we're asking people here is, do you regard yourself as more Scottish than British, or Scottish and not British? And that's those two lines at the top there, the red line and the blue line. These poor souls at the bottom here are primarily British, right flat, and there are a few citizens in the middle who regard themselves as in the middle. So what we see, first, that the dominant identity is either very Scottish or pretty Scottish. Very much the minority identity is not very Scottish at all or purely British. So why does that matter? It matters because we know that this drives constitutional preference. Here's the data. Again, Scottish Social Attitudes. There's another one out tomorrow. I expect it will say more or less the same thing. If you are Scottish, not British, 50% chance that you support Scottish independence. If at the other end you are British, not Scottish, pretty small chance you support Scottish independence. And a nice line driving down. So identity matters in Scottish politics. And that is a challenge for the British state. What do you do about the fact that the way you've arranged your union means that in this significant part of it, 8.5% of the population, 1/3 of the land mass, significant proportions of the people regard themselves as not quite belonging to your identity? Well, that takes us down the route of devolution. What do? Arguably, you accommodate. You make arrangements to allow for the institutional structure of the union to reflect the identity and preferences of the folk, and you create some form of devolved democratic institution building upon the fact, remember, let's go back to the idea of a union state, that you already have institutions representing separate Scottish identity, legal system, educational system, church, and the like. And the UK government's response was brought out in particular by the rise of Scottish nationalism, which was a fringe movement until the 1960s. And in the 1960s and 70s, it was given fuel, so to speak, by the arrival of North Sea oil and the slogan, "It's Scotland's oil," because of course the oil was accessed from Aberdeen or from Shetland. And we see, for example, in 1973, the Royal Commission on the Constitution, a UK-wide Royal Commission, suggesting all sorts of decentralising propositions, including devolved assemblies for Scotland and Wales. And in 1978, after legislation, we had the creation of some rather spatchcock-looking Scottish and Welsh legislative bodies with relatively limited powers, subject to a referendum in 1978. Rejected in Wales out of hand, wisely perhaps. Marge manages to get a tiny majority of the voters in Scotland, but had been in part sabotaged, if you like, by North of England MPs, insisting that there would be a threshold share of the electorate who had to support the proposition. Didn't quite meet that threshold. This is at the tail end of the Labour government, which ended in 1979. There were a lot of other fish to fry at that point. The country was in a pretty bad state, going to the IMF and so on. And when Mrs. Thatcher took over in 1979, she was having nothing to do with all this nonsense, and the whole thing was put into cold storage. And it's worth reflecting a little on Mrs. Thatcher's contribution to Scottish devolution. A very significant one, although she was, of course, deeply opposed to it. Because what happened during the 1980s and to a lesser degree in the early 1990s was that the restructuring, to use as neutral a word as I can, of Scottish as well as other UK heavy industry became a heavily politicised project, and the identification of a very English Conservative leader with the closure of mines and steelworks and shipyards burned itself onto the Scottish consciousness, the Scottish political consciousness, and is in substantial part the reason why Scotland returns all those Labour MPs and only that solitary Tory one. And it also put the Labour Party into the place of saying beyond all doubt that it was a devolutionary party, with more than the subtext that the purpose of devolution was to protect Scotland against another Mrs. Thatcher, as if there could ever be another Mrs. Thatcher. So what we've seen, and what we saw then, was that in response to this, the Union state became a devolved state. And that is to say, the institutions which reflected the difference of both Scotland and Wales, and in a different way Northern Ireland, were not merely administrative or legal, but became democratically elected. So what we've got now, and I'll just stick with the Scottish case for the moment, is a devolved parliament in Scotland. It is responsible for an enormously wide range of services and laws. It spends about half the public spending, virtually all the public services in Scotland, health, education, roads, policing and so on, are all devolved to the Parliament. It has full legislative powers over them. It runs the legal system, it runs the educational system, it runs the NHS. What it doesn't have is particularly strong taxing powers, and that's an interesting example of path dependence. If you were designing a federal or quasi-federal constitution, you wouldn't create a body which did all the spending over here and a body which did all the taxing over here. You would try to mix them up to some degree. And the Calman Commission, which Tony mentioned in the introduction, is a way in which the UK government is trying to rebalance that a little, adding to the powers of the Scottish Parliament, but also adding to its responsibilities. Now, devolution, creation of the Scottish Parliament, is a response to the challenge of nationalism and the issue of national identity. One Labour politician, I'm still in speaking terms with him, said that this would kill nationalism stone dead. Very unwise phrase to use. And interestingly, the nationalists themselves opposed it initially. Devolution was not the answer to the Scottish question. The answer to the Scottish question, obviously, was the creation of a separate state. Devolution was intended to prevent that, therefore it was a bad thing. But it was also very popular with the people, and eventually, from opposing it, the nationalists came round, and of course, they became the opposition in the Scottish Parliament. And actually, quite a successful opposition for the first two 4-year terms of the Scottish Parliament from 1999 onwards. The Scottish Parliament is elected on a system of proportional representation. Roughly, it's a list system with a mixture of constituency seats and regional lists. People get 2 votes. No one understands what each of them is for. They sort of understand the constituency vote. No one has a notion what the second vote is for. And the nationalists have used that very well. So they became a substantial opposition, certainly in the second Scottish Parliament. And it's in the nature of things that oppositions become governments at some point. Some oppositions quicker than others, you've no doubt noticed. But the opposition, the SNP opposition, became in 2007 by 1 seat the largest single party in the Scottish Parliament. Rather to their surprise, I think, and certainly to the surprise of the Labour Party, who took the view that it was their job to run this place. No one would form a coalition with them, and at least the presenting reason for that was that their manifesto included a commitment, if elected, to hold a referendum on independence. They were therefore in the position in 2007 of having a minority government, which they ran perfectly successfully. But they weren't able to do anything other than talk in the most general terms about their plans for a referendum. Now, it's important to understand at this stage why they would promise a referendum on independence. Do they believe in independence? Yes, probably, most of them. But the reason they offered a referendum on independence was to give the reassuring message to the voters that you can vote for us to run the devolved system without necessarily committing yourself to creating a separate state, because they could read the public opinion polls as well as anyone else, and independence was not then a particularly popular option. It also enabled them to deal with their own fundamentalist wing, people who thought, as the party leadership had in the 1990s, and that anything short of full independence was a betrayal of the cause, by saying that, of course, this decision would be given to the Scottish people, who are naturally sovereign in these matters. So 2007, a minority administration, perfectly competently running devolved services, and having rather fun, actually, poking the London government in the eye over one issue or another. And I know this because I was working for the London government at the time, and they were pretty hard to manage. But that, if you like, is decentralised politics. That's the politics of a territorial state. It happens in every federal country. The main job of a state governor in the US is to declare to his population how wicked Washington is. The main job of a provincial leader in Canada is to ensure that his province gets the best possible deal in the intergovernmental discussions that seem to dominate Canadian politics. And so it goes. That's what you would expect. It was a bit of a surprise in the United Kingdom, where particularly in the first 2 terms of devolution, with Labour-led administrations, both in London and in Edinburgh, the scope for public squabbling, at least, was limited. private squabbling is always available inside any political party. 2011, however, was a particularly exciting year. Although the Labour Party did remarkably well in the general election of 2010 in Scotland, actually increased their vote, despite what the opinion polls predicted, the SNP did extraordinarily well in the devolved elections of 2011. So well that against all predictions, and contrary to the expectations of those who designed the list system, it became possible for them to gain a majority in the Parliament, in the Scottish Parliament, which they did. To everyone's astonishment, including their own. They didn't expect this to happen. Nobody did. I'm not being critical of them. It was not one of the outcomes that anyone regarded as a plausible outcome in a devolved election. Then obviously they can form an administration. They don't have to form a coalition. They've got the votes in the Scottish Parliament. An interesting sidelight to that is that, of course, the mechanisms of the Parliament are designed on the assumption that there would be either minority or coalition. So the Scottish Parliament's committee system, its way of dealing with the allocation of business, it doesn't have Westminster's assumption that there will always be an opposition which is in minority and therefore needs a wee bit of protection. In the Westminster system, people know that they could be the opposition one day. So there's a little bit of procedural protection for oppositions in Westminster. In Holyrood, nobody thought it necessary to design that because, well, there will be several parties vying and these things nature will take care of that. Well, it doesn't when you have a majority administration. But the really significant thing about having a majority administration in Holyrood in 2011 is that the promise to have a referendum, which was a prophylactic, if you like, to stop, to make people vote for you in the devolved election, and perhaps a sop to your own enthusiasts, suddenly became a promise which could be delivered, at least politically, because a majority of the votes in the Scottish Parliament were available to the SNP. Cue a long period of reflection. Oops, that wasn't quite what we planned. There was then a degree of discussion about, well, what sort of referendum? Could we possibly have 3 questions? Could we possibly have a kind of pick and mix system? What would people like? The UK government played this one pretty cannily. Despite being pretty unpopular in Scotland, the Conservatives handled their tactics very well, as indeed did the Liberal Democrats on this one. I think tactical credit certainly due to the Conservatives here. They said referendum, certainly. Why did they have to say that? Well, the reason they had to say it was that although the Scottish Government had promised a referendum, legally the power to hold a referendum didn't reside with the Holyrood Parliament. Legally, the power to hold the referendum resided with the UK Parliament, which retained legislative competence, to use the jargon, over constitutional issues. And what the UK government said was, we are quite happy to make the necessary legal arrangements to give you the power to hold a referendum. They set some conditions, though the conditions turned out not to be very onerous. The conditions were, first, that there would be a referendum on independence or not, i.e. a binary referendum. Second, that it should be properly regulated, so it would be legal and fair, and that meant, for good or ill, regulated by the Electoral Commission, which has got into the habit of regulating all the referendums we've had in the UK in recent years. And thirdly, that it should be decisive. It's the referendum which will make the decision as to whether Scotland remains inside the United Kingdom. The powers were granted over a year ago now in what's called a Section 30 order. That's an order made at Westminster but agreed in the Scottish Parliament to extend the competence of the Scottish Parliament. The legislation passed rather slowly through the Scottish Parliament but has now been enacted. The referendum date is set for September 2014, meaning that we've had a campaign now running for already 2 years in effect, and we'll have it running for another 9 months. The campaigns have been set up. The Electoral Commission has started its regulatory process, so the formal regulatory period doesn't begin until June of this year. The question is, at least on the face of it, a very simple one. Should Scotland be an independent country? Please answer yes or no. Don't do it now. Think of your answer later. There is no third option, although if you look at the public opinion data, it's interesting that quite a lot of people in Scotland who do not favour independence do favour more devolution. The UK has already offered that in the work that Tony referred to, the Calvin Commission, that will come into effect in 2016, and it's certainly possible that the political parties will want to go further than that still. And the reason that they're in that territory is what this tells you. Here again, bit of public opinion data, Scots again. What would they like? Well, this is last year's data. This year's actually slightly different, but not much. About under 30%. I think this year's number will be 27 or 28% of the population favour independence as their constitutional preference. Those 10% of Daily Telegraph readers, whoever they are, who don't want any parliament at all, remain about the same. But the vast majority of people say, yeah, what I'd like is devolution. Or you might say, it's a no-brainer, you've got devolution, so independence isn't on the cards. Well, it's a little more complicated than that, because if you split up the devolution viewers, you'll see that they're pretty split too. This goes back to the question of identity, I suspect. So slightly different questions, you get slightly different numbers. 28% of people seem to favour independence. Slightly more favour an ill-defined concept called devolution max, i.e. more powers, more tax powers. 27% the status quo and 10% no devolution. So the real world is about here. The SNP would like it to be here. It's not perhaps surprising that the UK parties are edging in that direction, though I don't see them developing something called devolution max. It's quite, just to dwell on that issue for a moment or two, the challenge here is that the Scottish Parliament, as I said early on, has remarkably wide powers already. Its spending powers are more or less as wide as a state-level government in even quite a decentralised federation, comparable as a proportion of spending even to Switzerland or to Canada. What it doesn't have is taxing powers to match anything like that spending power. There are a number of difficulties with that. The most obvious is that the incentives on the Parliament are a bit lopsided. All politicians think spending is good and taxing is bad. But if you don't have to take any taxing decisions, you can talk freely about your desire to spend lots and lots more. And not surprisingly, every Scottish politician virtually, even sometimes the few Conservatives, are inclined to say, well, we really need to spend some more than that, because they don't have to take the taxing decision. But decentralising taxes is not so straightforward for a variety of reasons. The reason of principle, and if you look at federal systems worldwide, you'll see that no federal system has a system a financing system in which the sub-state body is wholly financed by sub-state taxes. They are all, to a greater or lesser degree, financed by what are in the jargon called vertical fiscal transfers from the higher level of government, if you like, to the lower level of government. There are two reasons for that. The first is a practical reason. It is much easier to collect taxes at a large level, because otherwise tax bases move around to try and escape taxes. Use the example of Google and Starbucks if you want to understand the mechanism for that. You locate the taxable activity, whatever it is, in the lowest tax jurisdiction you can find, typically in Europe, the Republic of Ireland. And the second reason is a reason of principle. If you regard the source of income for a subnational government as the money it can raise in its territory, then a national government has no scope to make horizontal fiscal transfers, move money from one part of the country to another rather than from one level of government to another, to ensure equity in spending. So that is not a particularly big issue in Scotland, because Scotland is a well-off part of the UK, even though it does enjoy high public spending. But let's imagine that we were to say to the Welsh Assembly Government or to the Northern Ireland Executive that they should be able to deliver public services in Wales or in Northern Ireland on the basis of the tax income arising in Wales or Northern Ireland. What level of public services would they sustain? And the answer is very low. They would not be able to sustain certainly the levels of public services they have today, or levels of public service comparable to anywhere else in the UK. And if you think a country, a nation, has some form of equity underlying its decisions about allocation of resources, then you need to have a mechanism for ensuring equity between different sub-national governments so that they're not wholly dependent on the accident of the tax revenue available in their own jurisdiction. So, and that's the challenge then for the devolvers, people who are interested in devolution max, under which all the taxes would be devolved. The extreme version is that everything would be devolved and the Scottish Parliament would send a cheque once a year to Westminster to pay for its share of the army, which is a wholly absurd proposition. But there are interesting arguments about just how far in this direction you can go for the tax reasons that I've described. The other big question, apart from tax decentralisation, is whether it is in principle the right thing to do to decentralise the one big element of public expenditure which is not devolved in the UK, and which is not devolved in Scotland or Wales or in practice in Northern Ireland, and that is welfare spending. One of the striking things about the devolution settlement is that it grew up out of the pre-devolution territorial departments, and they had no responsibility for transfer payments in the forms of pensions, benefits like job seekers allowance or universal credit if it ever appears, or payments like housing benefit or council tax benefit. Now, one can run two arguments here. If you're an extreme devolver and perhaps a nationalist, you would say, well, actually, that should be decentralised to us too, and we in Scotland or we in Wales can look after our own people. Our resources can be devoted to the poor in our area, and if, as it turns out, we're a terribly left-wing place, we can be generous to the poor and we'll not tax their bedrooms and so on. We'll abolish the bedroom tax. If, on the other hand, you think, once again, that equity matters across the UK and that benefits in Wales or Northern Ireland shouldn't have to be lower because the tax base is lower in Wales and Northern Ireland, you will argue for a UK-wide benefit system. What's very striking, if you look at federal systems worldwide, almost no federal system has substantial decentralisation of welfare. Almost all of them operate some form of national insurance. And of course the tax that we use in the UK traditionally, obviously it's not big enough, but the tax which is connected with welfare has that very name, national insurance. And I think the clue is probably in the name. So there is a debate about the extent to which welfare is suitable for devolution or not. I think those who are on the non-nationalist side of the argument might well be interested in some changes at the margin of welfare. So it's already the case that there is a plan to devolve council tax benefit, which, to be honest, should always have been devolved. I think myself that there's a perfectly plausible argument for the devolution of housing benefit, but whether there is a good argument for the devolution of old age pensions or universal credit or disability living allowance is a different question entirely. These processes are going on just now, and it'll be fascinating to see where they end up. And all of this, of course, is background to what looks like a fascinating referendum campaign. And if, like me, you are a referendum anorak, you will be looking at the polls on a near daily basis. And they're available online, you can dig them out, but here are a few. Now, I'm sorry this is a kind of wobbly set of numbers, but this is a collation of all the commercial polls that have been held in the last year or so. And they go up and down, not because public opinion is going up and down, but because of differences in the sampling techniques and approach of the different polling organisations. So most of these wobbles reflect the fact that this is Company X along here, which consistently produces larger numbers, and Company Y here, which consistently produces lower numbers. What we're seeing there is, as we statisticians say, nothing very much. The public opinion is stolidly unmoved. And what's fascinating about this is that it was the same 10 years ago. Go back to my constitutional preference numbers earlier. These numbers are wholly consistent with views that have been expressed in samples going back as far as 1997. Now, yes, no, and don't know. If there's a trend in this at all, it's that a few more folk are saying they don't know. Who knows exactly what that means? I will, if I can get the technology to work, no, I shan't. I was going to try and take the don't knows out for you, but I don't seem to be able to do that. If you take the don't knows out over the whole period, you're getting a number like 60-40. That has been pretty stable for the last 12 months or so. So it's been remarkably stolid. But on the other hand, who has ever indulged in a 2-year referendum campaign? This is longer even than a US presidential election. I think it's quite likely that the majority of the public are stopping their ears to these arguments. They are realising that they will have to make a decision. Well, I was going to say next September, it's this September. But imagine one of you, well, imagine the distinguished Tony here, and someone said to him, Professor Travers, I'm going to offer you a new job in September. And if Professor Travers hated his present job, which I'm sure he doesn't, he would say, yes, thank you very much, I'll accept that. If he loved his present job beyond all peradventure, which I'm sure he does, he would say, no, no, don't bother, I'm going to refuse it. But if he was an ordinary, rational citizen, he would say, oh, well, thanks very much, ask me in September. And I rather suspect that that is where a substantial proportion of the population is. To conclude, what's going to happen? Well, I'm not a Sybil, and I don't pretend to know whether these numbers are going to change. I think it's quite possible that they might, in one direction or another. Very hard to say. If the vote is for yes, which at the moment seems the less likely outcome on that data, but it's certainly not impossible. If the vote is for yes, that will be an earthquake in the British Constitution. It will be hugely significant for Scotland, but it will be much more significant for the UK than perhaps the UK has yet realised. This won't be the loss of a colony. It won't even be the disentanglement from many centuries of conflict in Ireland. It will instead be a core part of the nation state deciding to walk away. The political effects, but the legal effects will probably be quite small. The UK pretty clearly would be, in international law, the continuing state, so all the UK's rights and obligations internationally would remain. The political effect, well, would it mean that the UK moved markedly to the right and the Conservative government was more likely? Probably not, actually, because the Labour Party would simply adjust itself to the median voter in England. But the psychological effect on the state, of which bits are falling, could be very significant indeed. And the international effect on the UK's reputation would be noticeable. There's no doubt about that. Contrariwise, if the vote is no, well, would it be the end of Scottish sentiment and Scottish nationalism? No, I don't think it would. People won't change their identity. But it would be an enormous blow to that movement, which has been going now for 70 or 80 years. It will not, however, be the end of constitutional change for Scotland or for the UK. I think the UK's territorial constitution will continue to develop, certainly in the way set out in the Calman Commission, quite probably in the way that the parties are now working on. And it might be that the outcome of this was both a better defined UK territorial constitution, so that students would have something to look up when they were asked how does the UK organise itself territorially, and not regard it as an odd appendix to the textbooks. And as far as the Scots are concerned, it would probably mean buying into a relationship with the rest of the UK, which involved a very substantial slug of devolved power, as well as a clear understanding of what the boundaries were inside the Constitution between what is devolved and what is reserved to the UK Parliament. Ask me back again in September and I'll tell you which of those two answers it has been.
Okay, very good, very clear. Thank you very much, Jim. We now get an opportunity, we'll have an opportunity for questions. I just want to start off with one of my own, really, which is, and this is something that came up, one or two people in the room will have been around last week when we had a smaller, different kind of event where a senior official from the Scottish Government was speaking.
You tell me.
No. The question is this. Scotland isn't, I didn't know this, I'm embarrassed to say, and I hadn't read the documents in detail sufficiently. Scotland is committed, if it were to become a separate state, to creating its own constitution, that is, creating a formal constitution in a way that the UK, apart from in the way you've described it, hasn't. It's got elements of a constitution, but not a formal constitution. I mean, if it came to that, how do you think the process of writing a constitution for a country which is in many ways just would be a new country, but nevertheless it's a continuity, how do you think that would be done?
Yeah, well, my colleague, whoever he was absolutely right. Of course, it's not so much that Scotland as a new state would be committed to writing its own constitution. It would have to. Yeah. It couldn't possibly continue with, as it were, the scraps of the UK constitution that had been left to it. But this question of whether you codify a constitution or not is a very interesting one. The reason, well, there are many reasons the UK hasn't codified its constitution, but one of them is it's never had a codifying moment. It's never had a Philadelphia moment. And obviously, a referendum on independence would be a Philadelphia moment for the new Scottish state. What the Scottish Government has said is that there would be a commission, a set of wise persons who would be entrusted with this task, and that the constitution would be ratified by the Scottish Parliament. It's quite interesting because in their white paper, which I probably should have mentioned, the Scottish Government set out lots of constraints on what that constitution would be, for reasons largely of making it sound as unthreatening as possible. So Scotland would be a signatory to the European Convention. Therefore, the Convention rights would have constitutional status in the new Scotland as they do in the devolved Parliament today. There would be a single chamber Parliament with 129 members. Whether a single chamber Parliament as a national Parliament compared to devolved Parliament is the right question, is the right answer, I have no idea. I don't know.
Unicameral system.
Unicameral system, elected by the same electoral system as the one we have today. So all sorts of things have been that were written out of that script before they are written in. And it's slightly circular, of course. It's that Parliament which would endorse the Constitution, which made that Parliament the Parliament of Scotland. But that's what happens when you write a Constitution for the first time. Yep. You have to have some kind of meta law that says, this is how it is, guys, and from then on you follow the written text.
Okay, very good. Now, I've got some questions about, but I've got two from students here. So, Joe first, and then Alistair. Joe, and then we'll come to you at the others. Yep.
Kind of when you've been speaking, something I've always had to be doing in my head is separating nationalists with a big N from nationalists with a little n.
Yes.
To what extent do you think the rise of the SNP is to do with the rise of Scottish nationalism? Or do you think the SNP have come to the place they are maybe because of organisation or political failures within the Scottish Labour Party?
I think that you're absolutely right to draw the distinction, and I'm a kind of small N person myself, and going back to let me get this data, most Scots are actually, and they're primarily Scottish. If that's small N, then 80% of Scots are small N nationalists. And lots of institutions in Scotland are small N nationalists. So my friends in the Court of Session in Edinburgh, who are as stuffy a bunch as you'll meet, are nevertheless legal nationalists. What the Scottish National Party has been successful in doing is hitching a political project, political nationalism, onto this cultural, legal and other forms of nationalism. And I mean, one of the interesting challenges, I mean, I'm not a nationalist, I don't believe in separatism at all, but one of the interesting challenges for people like me is to say, well, what else does Scottish identity hitch itself to? You know, in 1707 or in the 19th century, it was very happy to hitch itself to the Scottish Church. And the Scottish establishment was very happy to hitch itself to the Scottish courts and legal system. And the Scottish commercial classes were very happy to hitch themselves to the Scottish banks. But as the world moves on, churches don't matter so much. The banks are in a dreadful state. The legal system, well, it's becoming much more homogenised. Where does Scottish identity hang on to? And it may be that one of the successes that the nationalists have is that people are looking for a parliament and a political process to hatch that identity onto. You asked about the weakness of the Scottish Labour Party. Well, the Scottish Labour Party has not been doing very well in recent years, and the reason that the SNP won in Holyrood was not that opinion changed on constitutional preference. If anything, opinion was going slightly against nationalism. SNP won in Holyrood because people thought they'd do a better job of running the devolved parliament. And not for me to judge, but quite a lot of observers would say actually they did okay.
So it was at some level, I mean, not to put words in your mouth or Joe's, but I mean the Scottish Labour Party was not functioning in a particular, it had been so much the establishment party that there was space for an insurgent party, to put it crudely.
Yes, that's absolutely right. One of the comparisons I like to draw is at the back end of last year, it is said, and it was in the paper, so it must be true, that 1.6 million people joined hands round Catalonia to demand an independence referendum. Well, that very same week, 8,000 hardy souls climbed the Calton Hill in Edinburgh to have a rally for independence. The first of those is a mass movement. The second is, by arithmetic, 0.5% of a mass movement. What you're seeing here is that the trigger for this referendum was the victory in the devolved parliament. It wasn't that people were demonstrating in the streets for independence, because they weren't, just simply weren't.
Okay, very good. Alistair.
I found it really interesting that you showed support for independence and Devo Max. And right now we have a referendum for independence. Do you think that if that fails, there would ever be a possibility of Devo Max in the future? It seems like most people would think that they'll almost become off the cards.
Well, I think it does. Well, one has to be careful about the phrase Devo Max. It's two half words stuck together, and whether it exists as a proposition is questionable. What you see if you dig into the opinion poll data, you will see that people, when asked, say that they quite understand that defence and foreign affairs and macroeconomics ought to be run from London, single economy, single external facing. And their default assumption is that everything else ought to be run from Edinburgh. And at a kind of superficial level, that's not a daft way to think about the allocations of functions inside government. But as I was explaining earlier, if you try and design a real decentralised system, you have to ask important questions about welfare. Why would it be like that? What would the implications of it be? And difficult questions about tax decentralisation and equity. So, and for those reasons, the kind of crude Devo Max of, as I put it, send a cheque each year for the army is not a real proposition. It couldn't be made to work. That's not to say that a bundle of greater devolved powers that somebody called Devo Plus, Devo More, Devo Max, Devo a bit extra, some such label could not be put on the agenda. I think it's quite likely that the propositions of the three unionist parties will move to some degree in that direction. What's already been done is a slug of taxing powers so that the budget of the Scottish Parliament is now will be 1/3 supported from its own taxing revenue. It could be that could get up to a higher proportion, for the sake of argument, 40% or a half or something like that. What I don't see it in practice ever getting to the 60, 70, 80 or 100%, and I don't think it should, as a matter of fact, in principle. But the more devolution thing will happen to a substantial degree in 2016, and to some greater degree. It will never get to what the SNP for a while were arguing for, was something called full fiscal autonomy, which was just a kind of independence in drag, as it were.
I think the Basque Country, others will correct, I think the Basque Country has something unusually near to that. It's very rare, as you rightly say, in any country to have anything akin to 100% of the taxes collected within a region that are collected and held there with a precept from the federal or national government. And I think the Basque Country is the nearest.
Well,
is it right?
Yeah, well, lots of people sing that song, so I went and had a look.
Okay.
The interesting thing about the Basque Country is that's what it says it has. But of course, there are three big taxes that matter.
Yep.
There's income tax. I'll use the UK examples, but this is true worldwide. Income tax, taxes on income, national insurance, social security contributions, and consumption taxes, VAT. That's what drives our tax income. Within the European Union, VAT cannot be decentralised. So there are actually two tax collection authorities in the Basque Country. They collect the Spanish VAT, but they don't set it. Yeah. So they have no autonomy over that. The Spanish government collects Spanish social security contributions, and the Basque Country don't have anything to do with that at all. So those are two of the three big taxes. What they do have is the capacity to set and collect income taxes, and set and collect corporation tax, but that's constrained by the Spanish Constitution. So there's less than meets the eye to Basque full fiscal autonomy.
Thank you for that. Very good. Now, any other students? Take a point, take there, and then we'll come to the back. Yep.
If in September the vote is yes, what will be the position of Scotland in the European Union?
Scotland in the European
Well, now
Union.
you've hit upon this month's highly political topic. There has been quite a lot of toing and froing on this. The best way to approach it is actually to look at what the European institutions themselves say. And what they've said consistently, actually, over a number of years, is that Scotland would be an accession state. And there would have to be an accession process. How long that accession process would take is an interesting question. But there is no provision in the treaties for secession and re-entry. The Scottish Government began by saying that Scotland would automatically inherit the UK's EU membership, but they've kind of stopped saying that now. What they are now saying is that there would be a process of treaty amendment under Article 48 of the treaties, as opposed to accession under Article 49. Hope I'll get those two the right way round. And that this process of treaty amendment would result in Scottish membership inside 18 months. Because one of the things they have done is, in their white paper, set a target date for independence of just before the next Scottish Parliament elections. There is no coincidence in that. What would actually happen very much remains to be seen. My own view is that there is nobody in Europe who wants to kick the Scots out. I mean, why would they want to do that? But there are people in Europe who have their own political domestic fish to fry, particularly Spanish fish. And Senor Rajoy has made it very plain that he would have something to say about the process, and it wouldn't be simple and automatic. In the end, this is a matter of politics, not law. It will depend on a set of negotiations, probably, in my view, structured as a set of accession negotiations in which there will be give and take. The interesting questions are, to what extent would Scotland, which meets most of the acquis for the community at the moment, be able to retain the concessions and opt-outs which the UK has secured over the years? The most important of those, obviously, is Euro membership. Would it, like any other new accession state, have to promise to join the Euro one day? What would that mean for the stability of any other currency arrangement it had? And rather oddly, would it be obliged to sign up to the Schengen agreements of freedom of movement, which would be very awkward if the rest of Great Britain and Northern Ireland didn't sign up to the Schengen agreements. And there are other bits and pieces of that sort, such as the UK's zero rating of VAT, which people tend to forget about. So would Scotland get in? Yes, probably. Would it be an accession negotiation? Yes, probably. What would the conditions be? Hard to say. How long would it take? Don't know, but 18 months sounds pretty challenging to me.
Very good. Right, now, question, something right at the back there and then the back here. Okay, yeah. So, okay, just to repeat that, the impact for the camera, the impact, potential impact of the way the English vote in the European elections in May on sentiment in Scotland, and question B, do the 16 and 17-year-olds who will be able to vote in the referendum, will they have any impact one way or the other?
Okay, well, to start with the European elections, I mean, I think you are right to identify these as a potentially significant political moment. They will be significant in England if, as many people predict, UKIP do well. That remains to be seen, obviously. We'll wait and see, but it's certainly quite possible that they will. And even though the chances are that the turnout in the elections will be quite low, because it usually is, if UKIP, at the extreme event, were the top party, that would say something quite significant. And it would certainly, its significance would, I suspect, more be how it affected the behaviour of the other parties than anything UKIP themselves would actually do. Would Scotland, UKIP is not doing well in Scotland. Scotland's got its own nationalist party. Okay? UKIP is an English nationalist party. So it's quite possible that in the European elections, Scotland will send some nationalists to Brussels, Strasbourg, and England will send some nationalists to Strasbourg and Brussels. Of course,
so they won't be sitting in the same group, I think.
I think that's pretty likely. That's pretty likely. The dynamic of that, very hard to say. It could have. It will certainly be talked up, particularly obviously by the SNP, as saying, well, we're completely different from the English because UKIP are not a nationalist party. They're a right-wing party, whereas we're a left-wing party, and we're not all that nationalist, really, if you don't mind. Will that have an effect? It's quite hard to predict. It's easier to predict the answer to your second question, and the answer is not very much effect. some people thought that the Scottish National Party took the view that it would be desirable to have 16 and 17-year-olds voting in the referendum because they would be more gung-ho. Such evidence as we have suggests that they are not. Edinburgh University did a nice piece of work, a survey and some qualitative work, and if anything, 16 and 17-year-olds seem to be less nationalists than their parents, which was a bit of a surprise, I think. But either way, the numbers are so small, they're not going to swing the result.
Unless it's very, 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 very tight results.
Yes, yes, extremely tight.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned equity and how important it is in a unitary state, and you seem to suggest that welfare was one of the ways that the state helped that. But there's been a huge debate recently about the economic imbalance in the UK, particularly the divide between north and south, and Vince Cable's comments about a London MP saying that London in the southeast is sucking the life out of the rest of the UK. How does that square in terms of additional powers that the Scottish Parliament should have to right that imbalance, and for that matter, the right of the rest of England and the other to right that imbalance? Because it's clear there is an imbalance economically, but not in welfare.
Well, I think you raise what is actually the real and underlying issue about the UK. The division in the UK is not Hadrian's Wall and the Scottish border. The division is London in the southeast versus most of the rest. The numbers, it's written all over the numbers. The irony is that if there's one, the bits of the UK that do well are London, the southeast, and the east of England. And if there's a fourth, it's Scotland. In fact, sometimes it does better than the east of England. If I was sitting in Newcastle, or in Manchester, or in Yorkshire, I would look north and be resentful and jealous, and I would look south and be resentful and jealous. My own view on this, and I don't claim to have an answer to your question, is that we have in London, for good or ill, an international city-state living inside a larger state. I didn't go on to talk about London finance, though no doubt we could. I think there is an absence in the UK of effective regional economic development, and there has been for 20 years, because all of our regional economic development policies have been based on the model of making the region supply side competitive. Get the infrastructure right, train the folks up, make the sites available, all that kind of stuff. It hasn't been too successful. We need, if I knew what it was, I'd tell you, but we do need a set of regional economic interventions that do actually make a difference. It's not at all clear to me what they are, and I don't understand whether there are such instruments that would work, as it were, against the fact that London is operating in a different marketplace from the rest of us. It's operating in a worldwide, particularly financial and services marketplace, where others are operating in selling JCBs or whatever it might be. Carry on.
Okay, yes, do go on.
Given that answer, has the Better Together campaign addressed this issue in a coherent way to ensure that in fact the no vote prevails? Because if it is the major issue, then the economic argument has to be articulated by Better Together better.
The Better Together campaign is the campaign to stay, or for Scotland to stay within the United Kingdom, as its name suggested.
Absolutely. I should be clear. I do advise the Better Together campaign. I talk to them quite a bit, and I would regard myself as on their side in this argument. It's pretty clear that if you look at where the argument is inside Scotland, it's an economic argument principally. I've heard Nicola Sturgeon say that. That's the deputy leader of the SNP. She says this is about economics. And all the polling evidence tells us that. There's a slightly daft question in the Scottish Social Attitudes Survey, which said if independence made you £500 a year better off, would you vote for it? The answer is something like 50% of people say yes. And the mirror image question, if it made you £500 a year worse off, would you vote for it? And the mirror image answer is 10% say yes. So, whoa. I don't actually believe that. I believe that people give those answers, but I don't think it actually reflects what people would do. But what it does tell you is that economics matters hugely. The irony is in this, go back to the beginning of my talk, in purely Scottish terms, you could argue that there's a sense in which Scotland's part of the South East. It's one of the bits of the UK that does okay. It's got the third highest per household disposable income. It's got the third highest GDP, and if you were to include the North Sea in its GDP, it'd have the highest GDP. There's a sense in which Scotland's self-image, as a poor kind of downtrodden place, has rather become disconnected from the reality of life for a lot of Scots, which is actually reasonably comfortable. Which is not to say that there aren't 20% of Scots who are in a bad place. Of course, there are substantial numbers of people here in London who are in a bad place as well. So, yes, could that argument be made better? Yes, it could, no doubt. It always can. Is it the argument that matters? Probably, yes.
Another question? Yeah, please.
Given that London is this quite unusual city-state, is that a good place for huge powers in Scotland to be concentrated? Or huge powers affecting Scotland?
Well, one way of dealing with the London problem would be to relocate Parliament to York. Huge amounts of economic activity would thereby be transferred. The efficiency of the city financial machine would be hugely improved because rents would go down, and York would do very well out of it. And I'm being slightly flippant to make the point that, of course, London's a city-state in the private sector, and it's also a political capital. And one of the interesting things about the UK is that all of our private sector power and all of our public sector power are concentrated in one bit of geography. And the media, and lots and lots of powers. To be fair to whichever government it was, they expelled some hapless BBC people to Manchester.
The Labour government, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure the BBC made the decision under its own power.
Of course it did,
theory.
yes. Of course it did, yes. But yeah, the striking thing about London is it's both an economic and a political capital. If you look at other countries, you have Frankfurt's at least as economically important as Berlin. Take that as an example. What can you do about that? Leaving aside my slightly flippant suggestion, it's not at all easy. I think you do have to look at regional economic development. I'm personally, despite the pain in the ass for government, quite a big supporter of the relocation of government activity if you can get away with it. And there was been a bit of that under both governments. In the end, I don't think it's not going to happen between now and the referendum, and I don't think it's the issue that will fix the referendum one way or another. But I don't think you can draw the conclusion from the fact that too much power is exercised in the geography of London, both political and economic. I don't think you can draw the conclusion from that a particular set of political powers affecting Scotland should be relocated from it. That's a constitutional rather than an economic geography question.
The question of, you mentioned there's been a discussion in Scotland about localising or nationalising, whatever the word be, benefits, or the possibility of taking social welfare spending and making decisions about that in Scotland, which would have the effect of transferring an enormous chunk of state spending from London to Scotland and put it in a very different framework. Now, that begs the question of the Scottish political spectrum that you referred to. If you take it at face value, So, you know, you said as an aside, and I know you weren't saying it would happen, you know, perhaps it could not introduce the bedroom tax. Now, the truth is, Scotland appears to have a political spectrum where 87% or 85 to 87% of the voters are in vote for centre-left parties, and 13% vote for the Conservatives, and that's about 13–14%. Chances are it's not quite like that, is it? There'll be centre-right voters, presumably, scattered amongst the other parties. Few countries have such a small centre-right grouping. Certainly the Scandinavians don't. Most European countries don't, actually, those that have left-right ideological splits. So can you explain why so few, there seem to be so few people in the apparent, as you showed your own slide about tax and spend, very little different in Scotland than in the UK. So where are all those centre-right Christian Democrat type voters?
Well, this is a question which the leader of the Conservative Party in Scotland asks all the time. Where are they? Why aren't they voting for me? I think there's a bit of history and a bit of myth. The history, of course, is that the Conservative Party in Scotland became thoroughly identified with Mrs Thatcher and the poll tax and the deindustrialisation and so on. And the Labour Party played a very skillful game at painting the Conservatives as essentially anti-Scottish, not merely anti-working class, but anti-Scottish. And as it were, cemented the image, Scotland's image of itself as a working class country. So people living in some comfort in the new town of Edinburgh in a Georgian villa will say rather sadly, of course I'm working class, you understand, because their mother once met a man who worked for his living. The second, so there's a kind of oddity, and the result is that substantial elements of the Scottish Labour Party have been quite right-wing. That's first. You asked, a lot of the centre-right folks, people who in other circumstances might have been attracted to the left of the Conservative Party, went to the right of the Labour Party in Scotland. Perhaps more significant is if you look at the electoral history of the Scottish National Party, throughout the 1980s, it was an electoral competition with the Tories, not with Labour. It didn't touch the west of Scotland in any significant degree. It didn't touch the former industrial areas of Lanarkshire or Fife or Midlothian. It touched comfortable places like Tayside and the farming area on the east of the country, and particularly the northeast, where of course Mr Salmond has his seat. And they systematically replaced Conservative members of Parliament. The Conservative members of Parliament whom I knew in the 1980s, the Tories, people like Peter Fraser or Barry Henderson or Alec Buchanan Smith, who were distinguished Scottish Conservatives, lost their seats to nationalists. Yeah. And that tells you that the nationalists obviously moved to attract centre-right voters. Lots and lots of Scottish of SNP voters are actually centre-right, because that's their demography, that's where they live. And although the SNP presents itself as a centre-left party, it's part of that same Scottish self-image of what I do is left of centre because I do what is left of centre, rather than actually examining the policies they have and the priorities they have. As I said at the beginning, the Scottish people, if anything, have moved to the right over the last decade. And if you look at the policies put into practice by the Scottish National Party, they have very skillfully presented as centre-left policies which are actually redistributive in the wrong direction if you're centre-left. Yeah. The most obvious example is university education, which has been made free north of the border, as you have no doubt spotted. If you look at the distributional consequences of that decision, it's a decision to distribute from the well-off to the less well-off. No doubt about that. So,
you mean it distributes money from the average taxpayer to the better off?
Well, the better off.
Better off gain out of it as well.
The better off gain because they're more likely to go to university.
Yeah. That's 6:30. We must stop. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Jim, again for a brilliant lecture. Thank you very much.